Good day, everyone. My name is Chris Jonas. I'm the Director of Communications with the National Association for Business Economics. NABE is the premier professional association for business economists and others who use economics in their work. We're pleased to present today's special event on race, mobility, and fairness in the U.S. economy. We're going to go straight into our program. Note that we will have Q&A open throughout today's panel discussion. You could submit a question to the moderator at any time using the Q&A box. Okay, it is my pleasure now to introduce our moderator for today's event. Former NABE Director Nela Richardson is a principal and investment strategist with Edward Jones. Nela, I'm going to turn it over to you. One second, Nela, you're muted. There you go.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. I'm so excited to moderate this discussion in this panel at a moment of reckoning when it comes to race in the United States. Both the human toll of the COVID-19 and the economic toll of the subsequent lockdown has fallen disproportionately on minority communities. Additionally, the horrific events of police brutality expose the country and the world to the reality of ongoing and systemic racism faced by Blacks. Fortunately for us today, we have an esteemed panel of thought leaders who have dedicated much of their careers to thinking about inequality and race. And so I am so very excited to start this conversation today, joined by Raphael Bostic, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Neel Kashkari, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Darrick Hamilton, Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, and Professor, John Glenn College of Public Affairs at the Ohio State University, and Mora, Professor and Provost and an Executive Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs for the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us on this important conversation. We've asked each of you to open up by sharing your perspective on the unprecedented moment we find ourselves in, and we'll kick it off with Raphael.
Thank you, Nela, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to be here. I'm glad that NABE was able to have this program, and I'm glad that NABE invited me to speak. I'm thinking about this, I really want to just start sort of very big picture and say, this is a critical issue. This issue of race and fairness and the relationship to economics is a critical issue for the country. It's a critical issue certainly for policymakers as we think about moving forward, but it's also a critical issue for our field in economics. And there's been a lot of discussion recently about what economics has or has not done. I think these are real soul-searching times, and those are hard questions that we're all going to face. I also wanted to say that at the very outset, this issue of race and its role in our economy, it's clearly a moral issue. There's a lot of philosophy around it in terms of what America should be, but I think it's really important to also recognize that this is an economic issue. The structural and institutional racism that we have has really been a drag on our potential output from a US economy perspective. And the thing that I think is really important for all of us to be thinking about is the word structural or the word institutional, because that means that a lot of the things that we take as given may actually be shaded by that history and perhaps should lead us to think differently about what those givens should be and how should we think about it when we get to that last word in the title, which is fairness, because we really do need to think about those things. A second thing I do think is really important to recognize is that this is a role that all of us have to take on. This is something that's going to be important for every one of us as we look for a new and improved way forward that includes everyone. And I'm really looking forward first to say to this conversation today, Nela. I'm really grateful that you're here to moderate us. I get to listen to you on a regular basis and other media settings. So I think we're in good hands, but this is a really important conversation. And I'm really hopeful that each of you, as you listen to our discourse, thinks about the implications of what it has for what you're doing today and how you think about what you're doing, because each of us, as I said, is going to have to take up the arms on this, if you will, and move forward and make sure that we try to get as much of the structural racism and bias out of what we do and how things work.
Thank you, Raphael. Let's turn to Neel next for some opening comments. Neel, I believe you're on mute.
Muted, Neel.
Yeah.
All right, let me try that again. Well, thank you, Nela, and thank you, Nave, for inviting me, and all of my esteemed panelists. Great to be with you. Let me pick up where Raphael started. So he started at a big picture about why this issue is so important, and I agree with everything that he said. And I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. My comments at the start are going to be more focused on what the Federal Reserve can do about it. And I know this is going to be a part of our discussion, but I'm just going to offer you some of my thoughts. And I'm going to break it down into three categories. One is the role of monetary policy in addressing disparities. Two is other research that we're doing. And three is what we're doing about diversity within the Federal Reserve System itself. And I'll go very quickly. You know, there's a lot of discussion about the labor market and the fact that different racial groups experience the labor market differently. You know, for the last 5 years since I've been at the Fed, I've been very outspoken, arguing against the interest rate increases that the Federal Reserve undertook as we were normalizing, quote unquote, policy from 2015 to 2019. I took that view because I believe that there was still slack in the labor market and that we might be raising rates prematurely and slowing down job growth, slowing down wage gains. And what we saw in the last couple of years is it was only at the very end of that expansion that we started to see different racial groups begin to close the gap. Not completely close the gap by a long margin, but begin to see some gains and finally start to see some wage gains in lower at the lower income levels of the job market. And so my view is there were big costs to us raising interest rates when inflation was still low and wage growth was still low. So I know there's going to be maybe part of the discussion today, and nationally there's a discussion to be had of what role monetary policy can play in closing some of these gaps. It's enormously important that we understand this segmentation of the labor market just so we can achieve our dual mandate, just so we can actually achieve maximum employment and stable prices. Whether we can take it further and actually use monetary policy to close the gaps, I'm open-minded about, but at a minimum, we need to do a better job of understanding slack in the labor market as experienced by different groups, just so we can achieve our dual mandate. So that's number one. Number two, outside the scope of monetary policy, we know that there are many disparities in our economy. Education disparities, health disparities, housing disparities, the list goes on and on. So what can the Fed do? Well, in 2017, the Minneapolis Fed launched a research institute called the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. And its purpose is to marshal the extraordinary research capabilities of the Federal Reserve System to try to focus on many of these broader economic disparity issues. So we have an inclusive economy where everybody gets to participate. And even if we do the research, even if we don't have the tools at the Fed to close the gaps directly, if we can arm other policymakers with the best research and the best analysis available, then they may be able to pick that up and take it forward. And so I do think that that's a very important role that the Federal Reserve can play. It's not just happening in Minneapolis, it's happening all across the system. But we've launched a dedicated research center focused on this, and we've brought many visitors in from around the country and around the world to participate in this research process. And I think that's an important role to play. And then third, very quickly, I think all of the Federal Reserve banks and the Board of Governors in Washington are very focused on enhancing the diversity of our own institutions and tapping into a broader universe of talent, both so we reflect the society that we represent and so we can bring in the very best talent available. And I can speak in detail about what we've done in Minneapolis. In the 4.5 years I've been bank president, we have literally doubled the diversity of our officer ranks, the top 50 or 60 executives in our bank, from around 12% to 24%. And we've done that while we've increased the talent of our officer corps. We found there's been no trade-off in increasing diversity and increasing talent. And I look forward to our discussion, and I hope we can get into these issues because I think this is really important as well.
Thank you, Neel. Thank you. And I'm excited to dig into that commentary about what the Fed is doing, as well as the big picture effect on the economy that you and Raphael both laid out. I want to bring in the academics because your perspective in looking at these issues, both for African Americans and Hispanics, is going to be so critical to both the solutions going forward and this conversation. Darrick, will you provide us some some commentary on a big picture perspective of where you see this moment now.
Yes, and following up on Neel, it's nice to see such a diverse panel here with my colleagues, and it's an esteemed panel as well. So, thank you all for all the work you do, and it is great work, and I'm glad to be amongst you. So my comments are going to point out the fact that our problems are just as much political as they are economics. We're here to talk about economics, but I think politics, economics, and identity. We think about race as an afterthought oftentimes. We think about race as an issue. But I think our current events that are going on now should lead us to understand that race is not an issue, but rather a pillar in this relationship of political and economic concentration at the top and some despair and vulnerability throughout the rest of the distribution. So to me, the paramount indicator of economic impact or well-being has to be first and foremost our health. And if we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, the dramatic racial differences in both infection rates and mortality, that's something presumably random like a pandemic, however catastrophic, has such dramatic disparate effects, is indicative that we are failing as an economy. I mean, there are estimates that Black people who make up about 14% of the population make up more than 30% of the mortality rates. That's not a well-functioning economy in my view. So why is the Black mortality rate so high? Well, it's an artifact of our racist, unjust wealth gap. Blacks have little liquid wealth to deal with shocks. Blacks also have inadequate health insurance coverage, and they are more precarious in their workplace conditions than other groups. We know the adage, they're the first fired, last hired. I mean, in this case, we dramatically shut down our economy to save lives. So pretty much many people lost their lives. It was pervasive. But as the economy, when the economy picks up, I suspect that if we don't do anything, we'll still find that they will be amongst the last hired. And others will point out comorbidities, but comorbidities is a product of your economic circumstance, your geographical circumstance. It's not as if comorbidities is the beginning precondition. We can argue that a political economy that's not working is a precondition to comorbidities. So ultimately, the only way an increase in inequality and racial disparity doesn't work is if the COVID-19 crisis brings upon a political movement that, in my view, moves us towards the fulfillment of economic rights. That would promote a moral and just economy. I would characterize it building on Roosevelt, but this iteration ensuring that it's anti-racist, both in its design and implementation. So if we think about an anti-racist economic bill of rights, where people are empowered with the necessary ingredients so that they can have authentic choice, that will not only spur economic mobility, but it will make us less vulnerable to the next economic crisis, pandemic, or climate catastrophe, which very well might occur. So we have an inadequate social safety net in place for at least the last 45 years. In my view, it's the result of decades of unmitigated deregulation, lower taxes on the wealthy, and gutting government services and social welfare. To me, the gross disparities that we observe today is not our destiny. Inequality and despair is a political choice, and we can make a different choice. So I think we ultimately need political movements to think about capturing our economy, capturing our government. And when we think about the Fed is in essence a public bank for the people, capturing our money.
Terrific. Thank you, Darrick. And I agree. It's hard to divorce politics in an election year on any topic. So valid to raise it here. Marie, you're in addition to being an executive vice chancellor, you're also a labor economist. And I'm really interested in pulling you in and getting your perspective on the labor markets and that impact, that disproportionate impact for minority communities.
Yes, thank you. And I also want to echo my fellow panelists. This is a very exciting panel to be on. And so thank you, Nabe, for having invited me and also for having hosted this panel, whether I was invited or not. So thank you very much. I have been a labor economist. I've been a faculty member for just about 25 years. So this fall will be my silver anniversary, I guess, as a faculty member in econ. A lot of my research has focused on the socioeconomic outcomes among Hispanic populations. And this goes back to my PhD dissertation. In fact, actually, even to my master's thesis. And some of the concerns that we have, or that I have, and those of us who study these issues, in terms of looking at a relatively large and rapidly growing population, considering what is happening with the socioeconomic outcomes, whether we're talking about health, as Darrick pointed out, wealth, asset accumulation, labor market earnings, they are all intertwined. It's important also to consider who studies in economics, because with econ, it's a profession that has a profound influence on policy. And so if we are looking at trying to diversify the economics profession, that's another important role, because then we would expect to diversify the research and then therefore diversify some of the policy implications and policy insights. I'm very fortunate, so speaking of the Federal Reserve System, I did serve on the board of directors for the San Antonio branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And I greatly appreciated that opportunity because I was able to share my perspective on labor econ. And again, in the state of Texas, Hispanic economic issues are an important part of that. My current work has been focusing on what has been happening in Puerto Rico and also among Puerto Ricans on the US mainland. And it's a group that often gets left out of some of the policy discussions. So I've been working for several years now with Navidad Rodriguez, who is president at the University at Albany SUNY, and Alberto Davila, who is dean and professor of economics at Southeast Missouri State University. In addition to my research, I've also been very passionate about promoting initiatives regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion in the econ profession. For example, I am a founding member and former president of the American Society of Hispanic Economists. I have also been director of the American Economic Association's mentoring program, which is a program funded by the National Science Foundation. So greatly thanks to the NSF, that is designed for traditionally underrepresented minority students in PhD programs, as well as newly minted PhDs in economics. I served as director for just about 7 years and just stepped down a couple of weeks ago when I took on my provost role here at the University of Missouri St. Louis. In addition, I've been heavily involved with the NSF advanced programs across the country. There's an NSF advanced community, and that community is focusing on looking at ways to promote institutional change for a more equitable and successful environment for women in STEM. A lot of the initiatives also deal not just with women, but thinking about, again, our traditionally underrepresented minority groups. When I interviewed last year for my position here at the University of Missouri St. Louis, I actually came in as associate provost for academic affairs and just recently took on the role of provost. My now chancellor, who was provost at the time, Kristen Sobolik, who is an anthropologist by training, was very excited about my work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and thinking about what we can do, not just as researchers, but also as administrators to promote a more equitable environment, not just about thinking about recruiting and training of students and faculty, but also thinking about that retention and future student success, and then thinking about on the faculty side, how do we promote more diversity, equity, and inclusion among our faculty, many of whom, again, will be involved with the research that helps shape policy. So if we don't have a diverse professorate, that may end up hurting us as a country in terms of having diverse policy, policy that is scientifically based. So with respect to this moment in time, we would certainly, as Darrick mentioned, we certainly don't want to let this go to waste. There's a lot of discussion, national dialogue talking about issues related to race. And I think that as a country, we would be remiss if we just let all this go by the wayside. Let's say we look back in a couple of years and we do not see a major change. This is the moment perhaps that a lot of us have been waiting for in terms of shifting the national dialogue and perspective on why we need to address racial and ethnic inequities. Just very quickly in terms of the current crisis with COVID-19, as Darrick said, a lot of what we're seeing is a result of more of our structural and institutional racism and inequities. So if we consider Blacks and Hispanics tend to be disproportionately represented in the service industry, including leisure and hospitality. Those were the industries very hard hit by the economic shutdown that was put into place. And then when we consider among those who could continue working, there are disparities in terms of who can work from home. So the Economic Policy Institute had a study that came out that 1/6 of Hispanics, 1/5 of Blacks, but 1/3 of non-Hispanic white workers were able to work from home. So this indicates higher layoff rates. That's why we're seeing one of the reasons we're seeing such high unemployment among Blacks and Hispanics, if we look at the numbers. And then among those who are able to work, because of the industries in which they work, they're more likely to be exposed to the virus. And as a result, if they're more likely to be exposed, this will lead to higher infection rates and also higher mortality rates, or higher representation among those who die as a result of the coronavirus. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate those remarks. And I want to pick up on that theme of the labor markets and also to this concept introduced of fairness, because I think that's an important lens to which to view the appropriate next steps post-COVID. And I know we all hope that post-COVID is much sooner rather than later. But both the Black and Hispanic unemployment rate now stands and hovers around 17%. That's compared to a still high, but much lower 12.4% for whites. And so as we think about how to emerge as a country from this post-COVID into a post-COVID world, I'd like to start again with Raphael to weigh in on how does this look? Do we continue to rely on a tide to lift all boats, or do we target, and how do we target these disparities that we know existed before COVID and have only been amplified after COVID?
Well, Neel, I think the way I think about this, we have a short run problem, and then we have the long run problem. The short run problem is we have a lot of people who are in professions, as Darrick and Marie noted, that are at risk in a pandemic sort of situation. And there are businesses that they work for, it's not clear what their trajectory is going to look like moving forward. So we've got to have real-time solutions and addressing for them. One of the things Neel mentioned, the center that he has in Minneapolis, we have a center on workforce and economic opportunity where we're trying to actually engage with workers who are at that place where they're wondering what their next step is going to be, and saying, here are some alternatives in real time that can get you living wages and hopefully get you on a more stable and more positive trajectory. So we're going to continue to do those sorts of things and engage. And I think in this time of crisis, that direct connection and contact is actually quite important. But one of the key things to try to avoid here is that the next crisis have this happen again. So we need to be thinking about what are some of the structural things we can do in terms of changing the networks of information for job availability, changing how education works to make sure that every child who grows up has a reasonable chance of getting educated in the skills of tomorrow, not just the skills of yesterday, to make sure that we have social structures in our communities such that when kids see the police, they don't feel fear, but rather they feel an embrace that allows them to really just own the place that they live. Like the space and the ownership of space in this country are things that we don't really talk about so explicitly, but they are real. And there are lots of researchers that have done work to say, even though something looks like a public space, it's not really public for everyone, which means that if you think about the workplace or interview rooms or all those sort of places, you have these spaces that are seemingly neutral, but in practice are not going to be. So I think that we have to understand all of those things. Now, there's one other thing I do think is important, and it's important for us as economists and policymakers, that there's an arc to this. And it's important that we understand our history. And I was thinking about compromise. You hear people talk about the compromises. So Darrick was talking about the New Deal. Well, they were compromising the New Deal to get that passed. All those compromises work to the disadvantage of African Americans, right? And if you think about sort of the 3/5 compromise in the 1700s, that was another one that worked directly to the disadvantage of African Americans and prevented them from being able to fully participate, or in some cases at all participate, in the bounty of wealth that's being produced. I think we have to acknowledge that history, think about what that implies for how we should think about people living today, and think about what sorts of things we might want to do differently to acknowledge that some people have been differentially impacted by those things, and that actually is not fair.
Well said. I'm going to shift a little bit. This question is going to start with Neel, but I'd like Darrick and Marie to weigh in as well, because Neel, your comment started with what the Fed can do. And I think that's an important and central aspect of everything, because the Fed has, as one of its mandates, the stable economy, stable prices, but also full employment. And we know that African American unemployment rate is generally, even in the best of times, twice that of the white American unemployment rate. And so the question I have for you at this time where we know that these disparities are continuing to grow is whether this is now the moment to heed to some of those calls to use a monetary policy to target the Black and Hispanic unemployment rate as opposed to the headline unemployment rate.
Well, thanks for the question. Certainly, I think it's clear that the headline unemployment is deeply flawed as a measure. It does not count so many people who are not in the workforce, who may want a job but may not be counted in the surveys. So I think we know that the headline unemployment is deeply flawed. Whether we could actually target Black unemployment directly, I don't know. But the way we think it works, it's supposed to work that our dual mandate, stable prices and maximum employment, are like a seesaw. And you're trading these two things off. And in an optimal monetary policy, these two things should be in tension. What we found in the last 10 years is we were undershooting our inflation target, and there was still slack in the labor market. And to me, that means monetary policy was too tight. We never reached that optimal equilibrium where there's actually a trade-off. The challenge would be if we did say, let's target Black unemployment and let's try to bring it down to, say, 5%, and let's say white unemployment then is 2.5%. Does that lead to inflation? And does that then get out of kilter? We just don't know right now. So I think we should be open-minded and examining it. But at a minimum, we need to do much better in achieving our dual mandate. And if we just do that, that will accrue benefits to lower income workers and minority communities that have not participated fully in our labor market recovery.
Marie, if the Fed had targeted the Hispanic unemployment rate, would that have made the difference, do you think, in terms of the outcomes that you've researched?
I would say that I agree with the comments that were just made. It might be difficult to focus on one particular group because we do have a lot of groups that make up the U.S. economy. I think what's very important to highlight about both Blacks and Hispanics is that they do represent a significant share of the U.S. labor market. So Darrick mentioned African Americans account for about 14% of the U.S. population. Hispanics account for, I don't know the exact, it's over 18%, but it's been a rapidly growing population, so I don't have the precise decimal point on that. But we're talking about large and growing populations, and so there is a concern that if these populations are facing racial and ethnic inequities, and that something is hindering their access to the resources that we have for the health of our economy, then there is an issue, because we can consider that this would be a drain in terms of our economic growth, both locally and nationally. It can be a drain in terms of thinking about our global competitiveness moving forward, and those gaps will continue to grow given the changing demographics. Again, these populations being having a higher population growth rate than the U.S. national average. And something else to consider that often gets overlooked, my favorite labor market statistic when the BLS publishes their employment report, I always look at the LFP rate, the labor force participation rate, first. I know the unemployment rate gets all the attention, but I think there's a lot to be said with respect to the LFP rate. And it would be, I think, in terms of thinking about monetary policy, to place a lot of emphasis on LFP and not as much on the unemployment rate. There are also gender disparities. So when we look at our the largest racial and ethnic groups, actually Hispanic women had the highest, and have had the last few months, the highest unemployment rate. We're talking about approximately 1/5 of all Latino workers ages 20 and above were unemployed. They also had a disproportionate decline in their labor force participation rate, which is suggesting that there is, again, there's more that's going on than just thinking about race and ethnicity. There are other intersectional dimensions that we would want to consider as well. And I think that's an important topic to consider.
And those are words that are good for our NABE audience on many levels, including looking at the labor force participation rate and not just the overall unemployment rate. So thank you for that. And Darrick, you have proposed a number of policies from living wages to baby bonds. And I know you have thoughts on the policy outcomes that you'd like to see as a result of COVID-19. If you could expand on this for us.
Yeah, I mean, there are limitations to what the Fed can do, and there has to be some fiscal intervention as well. So the fiscal intervention is ultimately providing a rights frame. So you named a few policies, but they all fit into the criteria of what are the necessary ingredients so that people can really have agency in their lives. A lot of our rhetoric has been around the ways in which the market facilitates choice and agency. But if you're hungry, if you're sick, if you have no capital, you really don't have agency. So I guess what I've been going to in my description of policies is ensuring that there's a use of public power to make sure that people aren't vulnerable to, maybe whims is a strong word, but the for-profit motives that often leads to extraction and exploitation, particularly to those populations that are economically, politically vulnerable because of their race or because of their economic circumstance. But I wanted to quickly jump in and say a couple of things about the question about the Fed, because that's an essential one. I hope I get to weigh in on it really quick.
Please do.
And I should be respectful and say I sit from the perch of the academy so I can sling mud at my colleagues who are in the trenches actually doing things and know how things get done. So first, let me lead with respect and appreciation for the task that you have. But the first thing is the bully pulpit of the Fed. When the Fed talk, people listen, and they can talk in ways that are nonpartisan. So they can be full-throated and talk about the vulnerabilities in our economy, and people pay attention when the Fed talks, including Congress. So simply collecting information disaggregated on the essential characteristics of despair, vulnerability as it relates to the economy is important in and of itself. So I think we got to get beyond the survey of consumer finance, which is an outstanding tool, but we need to collect better data on assets and debt, particularly for communities disaggregated by race or gender and other forms of identity. When they do right now, there's calls, and I'm glad when they present to Congress, you have to present the disaggregated information to force Congress to act. If you present the information, it becomes harder for them not to act. I think they can indirectly regulate banks a little more so that you can add some conditions to the lending, especially when there's a government program, like in response to COVID-19, that's using where the Fed is distributing some of the resources. Then some of that can be conditional, and that the companies have to be the banks can't lend to companies that don't have certain workplace conditions so that people aren't vulnerable and their workers aren't vulnerable. I think that I like Sherrod Brown's notion of the Fed providing direct accounts. And if we have people that have inadequate accounts or not having an account, in the 21st century economy, everybody needs to have an account. So I would love for the Fed to be a backdrop to ensure that everybody has some type of financial account, and perhaps expand into becoming direct lenders, not just lend to banks, figure out ways that can lend directly to the economy in general. But at the end of the day, as Neel pointed out, there's a dual mandate that sometimes are in conflict with each other. And there is a role for fiscal policy to alleviate some of the second of their two mandates. There is a role for fiscal policy. I've advocated for a federal job guarantee. A federal job guarantee is in line with what Roosevelt did when we had coming out of a depression. And right now, with 40 million people unemployed, we were in a depressionary type atmosphere where if we had a program to make sure that people are employed, like a New Deal federal job guarantee, and to do it in a way that's building up resiliency the way Raphael spoke about, making sure that when the next pandemic comes, we have in place a public infrastructure to better prepare us, that could employ workers alleviate some of the stress on the Fed and allow for a better economy?
Thank you, Darrick. And there's a lot to respond to, and I'm going to give Raphael and Neel both an opportunity to make a response. He set the table, so I'm going to allow you to choose from this buffet of different ways to impact this conversation, but really curious to hear your thoughts on next steps, on policies, on the limits of the Fed, on moves in research and opening up research in different ways, which I know that you've both been very active spokespeople and response. Raphael, I've read every paper you've written on housing and race, so I know that both of you support that with Neel's founding of the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, which is a partnership with academics. So really, wherever you want to take this response, feel free to weigh in.
Sure. Neel, I'll go first if you don't mind.
Sure.
First thing I would say is I think you've seen a pretty significant change in terms of the voice of the Fed in the last 6 to 8 months. Chair Powell, sort of with limited prodding from either of us, has acknowledged that as the economy had been growing longer and longer, it was helping new people, different sorts of people who hadn't been attached to the economy. And I think in the last 2 months, you've heard a lot of Fed folks talking about the issues of institutional racism and bias creating significant challenges. I'll tell you, I don't think that's going to change. I mean, I think this is a fundamental issue, and for me, I think the flip on this has really been, rather than talking about it in a narrow space like the Community Reinvestment Act, our voice has really been about, this is about United States economic potential. And by this institutional constraint is really preventing us from reaching our full potential, and it has competitive implications for the country. I think in terms of regulating banks, there's been a lot of discussion around the CRA and CRA reform. And the Fed has been pretty clear that we're going to be extremely thoughtful and deliberative to make sure that we take all the good things of the CRA and preserve them while modernizing them to get them to a better place. Then you talked about a couple things I think are actually interesting ideas that we've been deliberating, but they are much bigger ideas than just in this space. The idea about us having direct accounts, that's a fundamental change in the relationship between this central bank and the entire economy. And there are a lot of aspects to, do we give banks just to people? Do we give it to businesses? Do governments now have an opportunity? And then how do you keep that independence of us from local policies or federal policies that might interact with those things? So we do retail payments, so we're thinking about this a lot in Atlanta, and it's complicated. This is very complicated, but you should be sure that we are thinking about these things. So I actually think that's really important. Then one other thing that we've been clear on, which you just spoke to, is the fact that the Fed can only do so much, right? That this is something that is definitely going to require a broader engagement from policymakers in multiple parts of the government. And they've got to own this issue as part of theirs as well. And we've been saying that too. So I think you're looking at a new Fed on some level. You got two Fed guys on this panel. I think that's a reflection of a different kind of commitment that all of us have at a leadership level. And we're going to make sure our institutions don't sort of slink away as things move forward.
Thank you for that. And obviously, the Fed has said words that I haven't heard from Fed officials before, just in the last 3 months. So, Neel, I want to give you an opportunity also to respond.
Sure, thank you. I want to, first of all, I agree. I thought Raphael gave a very thoughtful answer, and I agree with what he said. And I want to just compliment Darrick. You've put out a number of very thoughtful, provocative, meaningful policy proposals that have really forced people to step back and think about them. And I always think about policy proposals and how do you put it into practice in the middle of a crisis. So let me go back in time. In 2008, I was at the Treasury Department during the financial crisis. One of the mistakes that we made under both Presidents Bush and Obama is that we tried to design housing assistance programs that were very targeted, because a lot of Americans were angry at the thought of their neighbor getting a bailout. My neighbor's not deserving, don't bail him out. So we tried to target our programs. And by targeting them, we ended up helping very few people. And we didn't help as many people as we wanted. And while we were trying to save taxpayer money, we actually ended up costing the taxpayer more money because the housing downturn was more severe than it needed to be. Fast forward to today. The Paycheck Protection Program was designed to be widespread. Almost any small business could qualify for it, come one, come all. Even that, even with a wide open aperture, there were big differences in who got access to the program based on whether or not they had an existing banking relationship. And then there was political blowback. And so it ended up being complicated and not helping, I think, as many small businesses as Congress had hoped. Now look at the Unemployment Assistance Program. It's not perfect, but it is by and large getting money to people who've lost their jobs. And because Congress extended it and they boosted it, I think that's probably the most meaningful support that's being provided to impacted families today. It's through the unemployment program. So whatever Congress designs going forward, whether it's a federal jobs guarantee or some revised unemployment program, I think we got to think through how's it going to work at the scale of the US economy. So I think about the federal jobs guarantee. COVID crisis comes out of nowhere almost. I mean, it wasn't on our radar screen last year. So within a couple months, it hits us. Now 40 million people are laid off. Where do they go? And what do they do? And so I'm not pushing back against your proposal. I'm saying all of these things we should look at. How do we put them into practice in the middle of a crisis? And what can we do in advance of a crisis so that they can scale up quickly? But I think we should be examining all of these proposals with a fresh lens and a fresh eye. What did we learn from 2008? What did we learn from the COVID crisis? And how do we better prepare ourselves for whatever the future crisis is?
Thank you. Thank you for that. And, I know Darrick's comments were directed at the Fed members of the panel, but I wanted to give Marie an opportunity to also weigh in because I thought he raised several issues that maybe from your lens as a provost or your background as a researcher you might want to address. And then just to prepare you all, I'm going to move to a question about the economics profession in a second. So get your thinking caps ready for that one. We have a lot of economists on this call. So Marie, would you like to answer some of those questions raised about policy, the limits of central banks, and perhaps other institutional policies that we could implement post-COVID?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I'm really enjoying this discussion, and so thank you for letting me participate in this particular question as well. I will say that from my perspective, again, as an academic and more recently as an administrator, just watching the Federal Reserve, the entire Federal Reserve System, and studying labor market issues, I would say that there has been a shift in the Fed, even before the last few months. I will say that Janet Yellen seemed to make a significant impact when she was chair of the Fed. I also remember this was back during the Great Recession, having been invited to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System to give a policy briefing update with, I think there were 4 or 5 other people with me, to talk about some of the research that was being generated. And my research at that time, I have a book, for example, on Hispanic entrepreneurs. And so part of the reason why I was invited was to provide that type of input in terms of thinking about, I think the name of the discussion was something about small business creation during the recovery, and thinking about the role that small businesses and entrepreneurs play, but putting on top of that a lens of focusing on racial and ethnic inequities with respect to the business sector. So access to capital is a big issue and has been, at least according to my research. And with respect to not just applying for loans, but if people anticipate being denied for loans because perhaps they don't have prior credit, then that might end up perpetuating itself. And so how is it that we can encourage more individuals, again, more entrepreneurs, to seek credit even when they need it, but who might feel, rather than being rejected, that they would rather try to find the needed financial capital from other resources. Darrick also mentioned in passing, we do have a population that is unbanked, and I think that's an important population to consider. How is it that we can provide financial services to a population that does not even have a bank account and might have a distrust of banks? And so that would be another role for the Fed. I would also like to mention that I think it was 2016, I was fortunate to have been part of a small group that was invited by Mark Morial at the National Urban League. He had arranged to have a meeting with Janet Yellen at the Fed to talk about racial and ethnic issues and how do we support our communities of color with a focus on African American and Hispanic communities. And I thank Bernard Anderson for having arranged me to be part of that discussion. And it seemed like the type of discussion that even several years ago we would not have envisioned. I would not have envisioned within the Federal Reserve System. And I think the Fed can also play a role in terms of facilitating some of the research, promoting research that exists. For example, I know that we have all of the Federal Reserve banks host a lot of great conferences. And so several years ago, I partnered with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta a couple of different times to host conferences on Hispanic economic issues. And I think that's another way that we can tap into our research expertise when we are focusing or trying to raise awareness and learn about the policy implications that are affecting a significant portion of our population. And then again, I had mentioned I was on the board of directors at the San Antonio branch of the Dallas Fed, thinking about ways that we can diversify our board of directors and getting that type of feedback and input up through the chain of command through the Federal Reserve System is also critical.
Thank you for that. I think those are a number of great issues, and I've written some things down that I want to circle back to you. But before I do that, I want to turn now to this open letter that Howard University professor Bill Spriggs wrote and is posted on the Minneapolis Fed website, talking about the role of the economics profession has played in either implicitly or explicitly perpetuating a narrative that ignores racism or the role of institutions in racial gaps. I'm going to Darrick on this one because you have been a lead scholar in stratification. Could you expand on some of the blind spots that maybe the economics profession has on the topic of race?
So earlier, Raphael mentioned the word compromise in a large trajectory of our history, and that it was typically a Black population that was compromised in the interest of getting something done. That speaks to the point that identity, again, is not just an artifact, it is integral to how our economy and our whole political economy works. And the economics profession has not done well enough to integrate perspectives on the strategic use of race as a mechanism by which distributions are made. And that is a failing of the discipline. I'll say, Mora has done Yo Women type work in pushing back against that, of facilitating new scholars that can push back against that, as well as others. But I'm an economist, I'm committed to economics. There's a lot of great things that economics does. But the irony, a discipline that's often accused of being hyper-rational, treats racism as some bigoted preference that should be arbitraged away by the market and does not have a good understanding of the ways in which identity is strategically used in transaction or in systems as to facilitate some versus others. And that's a failing. In fact, that failed in that, the hegemony is not the right word, but the consensus that we're individual atomistic agents trying to optimize towards some objective, and that those that have the right stuff, that have the human capital, that have the character, the moral aptitude, whatever it is we want to characterize as the right stuff, that those are the ones that markets facilitate, and those without are ones that markets sanction, is hostile to people from subaltern backgrounds who want to explain persistent group inequality. So I'm saying that the discipline itself, there's some irony in that we need diversity in the discipline to perhaps affect the thought out of the discipline to better explain our entire political economy. But the irony is that the thought in the discipline right now might even be hostile to attracting some of those individuals. So we have a problem, and I'm glad there are people dedicated to trying to address it. And, you know, I'm glad you pointed to Bill Spriggs, because he's another individual that's done a great deal in his life and trying to affect change in this discipline.
Thank you.
So Nela,
Yeah.
can I jump in here just for a
Please.
second?
Sure, please.
So I just wanted to go in two directions, and I'll try to be brief. The first is, you know, Darrick's last point about because certain groups of people are not in the field, we're not asking the full range of questions that we might ask. I would just put forward two questions that I think all of us should think about in this context. The first is, how do we not have history continue to be a penalty for African Americans, right? All these compromises that have put African Americans at a disadvantage. What are the things that we might do to put that history behind us and really treat people, give people an opportunity? And that's true for Latinos and a whole host of others who have faced similar challenges. I actually think in my work, I do a lot of home ownership stuff, underwriting. Wealth is one of the inputs, right? But African Americans for many, many decades were prevented from accruing any wealth, right? And so as long as that's in, they're going to be at a disadvantage. And the second question I would ask for the field is, how should we think about the residual, right? We acknowledge all these disparities, and in most studies, if you put in all the controls that you might want to control, there's still that residual. Like, how do we think about that? Do we talk about that enough? Do we try to unpack that in ways that allow us to have different conversations? That's really important. And then the third thing I wanted to just say is on the issue of getting more people involved. I actually think there are a whole host of institutional barriers that are preventing that diversity in the field. And I actually think it starts in grade school, right? So when teachers have young minority students, or women in particular, and they're having a little harder time in their math or their science, I actually have gotten the sense that the teachers sometimes say, oh, it's okay, you know, you're not really supposed to be good at that stuff anyway. And whether they say it explicitly like that, or they send signals, by the time we see them in high school or college, they've had so much negative reinforcement that the idea of being in economics or finance is not really on the table. So we're actually trying to change curricula at the 5th and 8th grade levels to try to have an environment that is much more welcoming, so that we get a different set of people who think of economics and finance actually as a possibility, because we actually need them. That'll make us better collectively as a field.
Yeah, I think as a profession, the questions that you get to ask as an economist and answer are so attractive to people who care about their communities from a lot of different angles. So in that sense, it's a really great profession for those who are interested in answering social, political, and economic questions in a really rigorous way. So thank you all for that. One thing that I really enjoyed about this conversation, and it's a question as I look through the questions we're getting from the people who are watching, is that all of you have spoken on multiple levels. You've looked out at institutions, but you're also looking inward on what your respective institutions can do. And so, Neel, you started out this panel by going through a list of 3 different items that you thought the Fed could act. And Raphael, you've made that explicit on the Federal Reserve website there in Atlanta as well. So I want to probe this question on diversity and inclusion. It's a conversation that the business community is having. It's a conversation that the federal agencies are having. It's just a broad conversation, and it's happening to a degree that I'm almost convinced, that we might actually move from words to actions. So I want to pick up with you, Neel, on talking about how the Fed is looking inward. I know Raphael has comments on this, and I know Marie has been working on this issue a lot in the various academic roles she had. So let's do the roundtable there, and of course, Darrick, you're always welcome to weigh in as well. So starting with Neel.
Well, I'll just tell you from my own experience. When I joined the Minneapolis Fed in January 2016, I found that communities of color among our employees, we have about 1,000 or 1,100 employees, felt unincluded. I don't know if excluded is the right word. They did not feel included. And so I met with them, and I wanted to get a firsthand understanding of what their life has been like. We made a bunch of policy changes right away. You know, we said we are going to have panel interviews where people from across the bank would be interviewing people, not just one department interviewing for itself, because they tend to want to hire their own kind. We said we're going to adopt the Rooney Rule, where we have to interview qualified, diverse candidates and women candidates for all positions. We did 360-degree feedback on all supervisors and managers and officers, so we could see, are these actually effective in leading people and in managing? And the most important thing we did was an accident. It wasn't about diversity, was we confronted underperformance. I found when I joined the bank that there was a culture of job for life. And for its own sake, I said, we're not having that anymore. We are going to confront people who, especially officers, who are not meeting the standards that we expect. And we ended up exiting quite a few officers from our bank. And those are not easy conversations to have, but that created space. And now all of a sudden, all of the other work that we're doing on recruiting and on broadening our networks, all of a sudden we have all this space to go out and hire wonderfully talented people. So I mean it. It was a little bit of an accident, but we dramatically increased our talent level, and we doubled the diversity of our officer ranks in four and a half years. And so I feel like that's a key to it. Unless you are willing to really have the hard conversations with the underperformers, you're never going to create the space to really transform your organization in any reasonable period of time. And so I think if we could do it, there's no excuse. Other people can do it too.
Great, thank you. And Marie, can you tell us a little about how you've approached it from an academic lens? We could do a whole nother panel on faculty diversity and inclusion, and maybe that's one topic we'll pick up. But if you can just kind of skim the surface of your work and explain to us how we can increase that diversity and inclusion perspective on college campuses as well.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And it really does complement a lot of the research I've done. So my research, service, and teaching have all kind of come together in terms of trying to find ways that we can promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And actually, Neel just hit one of the issues. You know, we talk a lot about diversity, but not as much about inclusion. And inclusion is often harder to accomplish than diversity. If we are just recruiting a lot of faculty from underrepresented minority groups, but we don't provide the sources of support and the feelings of inclusion, then we are likely to lose them. So it doesn't really do that much good if we're just simply recruiting and we just leave people on their own, and then we end up losing them through not retaining them. As administrators, and actually as faculty, I've served on many, as a faculty member, served on many faculty searches. Two of the most important things we do at institutions of higher education relate to who we hire. And so faculty recruitment is extremely important, but also who is it that we are retaining and promoting. And so if we think about recruiting for diversity, there are things that we can do in terms of having more inclusive search processes. We can think about our training of our search committees, but then we also need to think about the environment in which faculty members find themselves. If they are feeling isolated and unwanted or undervalued, if they're feeling overburdened by service, in fact, that is something that often happens because there are so few. You can say, especially in STEM and in economics is one of the STEM fields. It's part of the National Science Foundation, director for the social, behavioral, and economic sciences. If you're one of the only, then you might often get tapped into doing, fulfilling the, some kind of quota, like we need to have women on search committees or minorities on search committees. And that can turn a lot of people off, especially if they feel like that work is not valued. And so institutional policies that enhance the culture and climate of an institution would be really important. And then we have to consider our tenure and promotion policies. And what is it that we're evaluating faculty on? We should be aware of the implicit biases that exist out there. For example, with our external support letters, if evidence shows that we as a society tend to use different words to describe women candidates, as well as both women and men from underrepresented minority groups. As an evaluator of those types of letters and those types of so-called assessment measures, we may be missing the point in terms of the true value that these candidates are bringing to us. And then I guess just coming full circle, if we don't have a diverse professorate, then we do lose the diverse perspective and insights. We are also losing the role model effect that we have. So as was mentioned, we don't often think, like if we were to close your eyes and picture, like who's an economist? Look at the picture of all the Nobel Prize winners in economics, and that will tell you what the long-standing issues, or I guess the traditional economist has looked like. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, we're like among the two non-economists here," and it's like, Well, I am actually an economist. I was one of the presenters, in fact. But we just have to change the mindset in terms of who belongs in this profession. We all belong in the profession. I love being an economist, by the way. And so I can't imagine having done anything else. I love it. But we certainly have a lot of work to do in terms of raising diversity, equity. And again, that key thing, we need to consider, how do we increase inclusion?
Thank you for that. And as I predicted, because I am an economist, this conversation has flown by. We're at time. I'm going to take a little latitude because I hope people are as engaged in it as I am, because I want to circle back one more time to Darrick and Raphael, who were excluded from this round. But if you could sum up, and I know this is going to be challenging, but your last thoughts in 30 seconds, both of you, and appreciate that. I know it's going to be more than 30 seconds, Darrick, but let's play along. And then, and I appreciate that. So Darrick, and then Raphael, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm going to talk really fast. So in addition to the residual around race, I think economists need to do better in operationalizing race, define race, what they mean by race. They just throw it in a regression model. And referencing one of those Nobel laureates, Arthur Lewis, a Black Nobel laureate, he talked about competing and non-competing groups. So if the issue is pipeline, he talks about how social hierarchy is created by rendering a group non-competing by controlling who has access to the credentials to get rewarded, and even defining the credentials to get rewarded. And then when those individuals are able to get those credentials, that's when discrimination comes to play. Once they become competing, then discrimination is used to maintain hierarchy. So we find that when Blacks actually have higher levels of education compared to whites with higher levels of education, the disparities often widen in that strata. So there are a cadre of Blacks that do have the prerequisite credentials to get a degree in economics. The question is, why don't they? And to my view, but that's not to say that we need to improve skill sets in grade school as well. But that in addition to that, there's this issue. I'll also say that one last thing, big shout out to Neel, because he hit it on his head. A lot of these issues are leadership. Make it happen. Neel said, I chose to do this, and I did it. And he's not alone. There are other examples of that. And people cite that as anecdotal evidence, and can you generalize about it? If we start generalizing leadership to do and behave the way Neel does, sorry to use the word behave, but implement programs the way Neel does, perhaps we'll see this wider change. And the last point I'll make is that when we think about action, we'd be naive to think that these things are occurring, all the positive things we talked about on this call, in the absence of political movements, in the absence of Black Lives Matter, in the absence of Me Too movement, in the absence of people coming together and redefining our worth, not simply in the traditional economic notions of well-being, but in common humanity notions, in solidarity notions. That's what's leading to this change.
Thank you, Darrick. That's very well said. Raphael, you get the last word before we conclude.
Well, yeah, Darrick is a bad person to follow. I'm just going to say that. But just suffice to say, I want to talk about hiring and internal practices. First thing, you got to have real numerical benchmarks. You have to have something that you're pointing towards as the metric. But I don't think you need a quota per se. I actually agree with Neel. Neel, he talks about this extremely eloquently, in that you can get diversity without having to sacrifice quality, but it takes work. It means that the usual pathways and approaches aren't gonna cut it. And so you need to find new ways to get those pools together, and then you can just assess them. You'll find there are really great people out there that perhaps you didn't know. And that's another part of the structural, institutional constraints that a lot of people sort of on the outside of your historical connections face. The last thing I'll say, and I want to end on an optimistic note, for me, I've never seen a period where so many people are willing to actually have plain conversations about this. And it's almost as if we've had an awakening to the reality that this is something that, while it's made all the way all around, like, we are getting a different understanding about how much cost it is imposing on all of us. And I think as long as that stays central in our mind, really amazing things can happen. And I'm thankful for NABE. I'm thankful for all of my panelists for pushing on this. Nela, it's been a great time talking with you. There's work to do, but I think we're really well positioned to do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Raphael. Thank you all. Neel, Kashkari, Darrick, Hamilton, Marie, Mora, thank you for this conversation. You've all heartened me. So appreciate your time in this conversation. Thank you all. Chris?
Great, thank you all. Before we sign off, I did want to mention a few other upcoming NABE events, including part 2 of our career-focused webinar series, which will take place on Monday, July 6th. This will be the outlook for the economics job market amid COVID-19, and will feature Peter Henry from NYU and Hal Varian from Google. Also, we have a few more installments upcoming in our Perspectives on the Pandemic series, which will feature leading voices and economic thought leaders sharing their insights with NABE members. We'll have Claudio Borio this Thursday, July 2nd, and then Fed Presidents Thomas Barkin and Mary Daly on July 7th. If you're not a member of NABE and are interested in joining, please go to nabe.com/join. Recordings of all past webinars are available through the NABE Connect app, which is available on the App Store and Google Play. And NABE members can also access webinar recordings through the nabe.com digital archive. Thank you all again. Today's program is copyright 2020 by the National Association for Business Economics with all rights reserved. This does conclude the event. I want to thank our panelists and thank all of our attendees for participating. Thank you. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.